something strange is happening, and almost nobody is talking about it. The people who think differently, who see the world through a lens most can't even comprehend, who carry the kind of psychological depth that used to drive entire movements in art and philosophy and spiritual revolution. They're vanishing, not dying, not leaving. They're being slowly, systematically erased by a world that has become structurally hostile to how their minds work. And the most disturbing part is that many of them are erasing themselves voluntarily because the pain of existing as who they actually are has become unbearable. Carl Jung predicted this would happen. Decades before social media, before algorithmic culture, before the relentless machinery of conformity became invisible enough to go unquestioned, Jung identified a pattern that chilled him. He saw that the personality types most essential to humanity's psychological evolution were also the most fragile, the most easily crushed, the most likely to disappear when a society shifts from valuing depth to rewarding surface. And he warned that if these types vanished, something irreplaceable would be lost, not just for those individuals, but for the collective consciousness of the entire species. Today I'm going to show you which personality types Jung identified as endangered, the specific mechanisms that are driving them underground, why their disappearance represents a psychological crisis most people can't even perceive, and what happens to a civilization that successfully eliminates the very minds it needs most. To understand what's being lost, you need to understand what Jung meant when he talked about psychological type. He wasn't talking about personality quizzes or four-letter codes. He was describing something far more fundamental. Jung observed that human consciousness organizes itself along specific axes. Some people process reality primarily through thinking, others through feeling. Some orient toward the external world, others toward the internal. Some perceive through their senses, others through intuition. And the specific combination of these orientations creates what Jung called a psychological type, a fundamental way of engaging with existence. Jung found that certain combinations were common. Society was built by and for these common types. The structures, the reward systems, the social expectations, the definitions of success and normalcy, all of it reflected how the majority's consciousness operated. This wasn't conspiracy. It was simply how collective systems work. The majority builds the world in its own image, and everyone else has to adapt or suffer. But Jung identified specific types that were genuinely rare, not rare in the way people casually claim uniqueness on the internet. Rare in a measurable, observable way. These types represented perhaps 5 to 10% of the population, and their consciousness operated so differently from the majority that they experienced the normal world as fundamentally alien, not uncomfortable. Alien, like being a species that breathes water, forced to live on land. The rarest types Jung documented shared specific characteristics. They were dominated by introverted intuition, a function that perceives not what is, but what is becoming. They saw patterns beneath surfaces, trajectories before they manifested, connections between things that appeared unrelated to everyone else. Their consciousness naturally operated at depths that most people only touched during crisis or profound meditation. And this wasn't a skill they developed. It was the default setting of their perception. They couldn't turn it off anymore. Then you could turn off your ability to see color. Jung also identified rare types driven by introverted feeling, people whose value systems were so internally generated, so independent of social consensus that they operated from a moral and aesthetic compass invisible to others. These individuals didn't adopt values from their culture. They discovered values through an internal process so private and so complex that they often couldn't articulate why something mattered to them. They just knew, and that knowing was more reliable than anything external validation could provide. These rare types weren't better than common types. Jung was explicit about this. Every type had value. Every orientation served a function. But rare types served functions that common types couldn't perform, functions that were essential for the health of the collective, even though the collective rarely recognized their value. They were the ones who saw around corners, who sensed cultural decay before it became visible, who created art and philosophy and systems of meaning that the majority would only understand generations later. They were consciousness scouts, operating at the frontier of human awareness. And they're disappearing. Jung saw the early signs of this disappearance in what he called the tyranny of extraversion. He observed that Western culture was increasingly organized around extroverted values, external achievement, social performance, measurable productivity, constant stimulation. The inner world was being devalued systematically. Reflection was rebranded as avoidance. Solitude was pathologized as isolation. Depth was dismissed as overthinking. And the personality types that required inner space to function were being squeezed out of a world that left no room for inwardness. This pressure has intensified beyond anything Jung could have imagined. Think about what the modern world demands: constant connectivity, perpetual availability, self-promotion as survival strategy, performance of identity across multiple platforms, speed valued over depth, output measured in volume, not quality. Every system, education, employment, social life, even healthcare, is designed for people who process externally, act quickly, network effortlessly, and perform confidence whether they feel it or not. Now, imagine you're someone whose consciousness operates at depth by default, someone who needs hours of solitude to process what most people digest in minutes, someone whose perception works on timescales that don't match quarterly reviews or content cycles. Someone who sees patterns so complex that explaining them requires patience nobody has anymore. You're not lazy, you're not antisocial, you're not broken. Your consciousness simply operates on different infrastructure than what the world is built for. What happens to that person? Jung documented exactly what happens, and it's a slow-motion psychological catastrophe. The first stage is masking. The rare type learns early that their natural way of being is unwelcome. The child who stares out the window, processing complex internal imagery, gets diagnosed with attention problems. The teenager who needs deep conversation instead of group socializing gets labeled as awkward or depressive. The young adult who can't perform enthusiasm in job interviews gets filtered out of opportunities, so they learn to mask, to perform the personality the world rewards, to suppress their natural depth and simulate the surface engagement that gets them through the day. This masking isn't harmless. Jung called it the overdevelopment of the persona at the expense of the authentic self. The person becomes increasingly skilled at appearing normal while their actual consciousness atrophies from disuse. They're performing extraversion while their introverted intuition starves. They're simulating shallow engagement while their capacity for depth goes dormant. And over time, the mask becomes so familiar that they forget it's a mask. They lose access to who they actually are. The second stage is self-pathologizing, because the rare type's natural way of being doesn't match what society calls healthy. They begin to believe something is wrong with them. Their need for solitude becomes evidence of social anxiety. Their depth of perception becomes overthinking that needs medication. Their inability to enjoy small talk becomes a social skills deficit requiring therapy. Their discomfort in overstimulating environments becomes sensory processing disorder. Every natural expression of their type gets translated into a diagnosis. Jung would be horrified by this, not because these conditions don't exist, they do, but because the diagnostic framework can't distinguish between genuine pathology and a rare personality type being crushed by an incompatible environment. The fish doesn't have a swimming disorder. It's been placed on land, but every assessment tool measures its ability to walk, and every treatment plan focuses on teaching it to breathe air. The third stage is withdrawal. Eventually, the rare type can't sustain the performance anymore. The energy required to mask, to simulate, to suppress their natural consciousness while performing an artificial one, it becomes unsustainable. So, they withdraw. Not dramatically, quietly. They stop attending events. They shrink their social circles. They retreat into increasingly private spaces. From the outside, this looks like depression or agoraphobia. From the inside, it's survival. They're trying to preserve whatever remains of their authentic consciousness before the world grinds it completely away. And now, something that should concern everyone. This withdrawal means rare types are removing themselves from the very spaces where their perception is most needed. They're not in boardrooms sensing the pattern that will collapse the company. They're not in communities identifying the social fracture before it becomes a crisis. They're not creating the art that forces collective consciousness to evolve. They're in their rooms, exhausted from performing a personality that isn't theirs, believing they're broken because the world never built a single system that could accommodate how they actually function. If you're feeling the weight of this, if something in Jung's framework is helping you see your own experience through a different lens, our new guide, True Self-Discovery, offers 24 practical reflection exercises inspired by his teachings, designed to help you find your way back to who you actually are beneath the masks the world demanded you wear. Click below to get True Self-Discovery. Jung identified a fourth stage that's even more disturbing. He called it type falsification, the complete abandonment of one's natural psychological type in favor of an adopted type that the environment rewards. This isn't just masking anymore. This is a fundamental restructuring of consciousness. The person doesn't just perform extraversion. They become extroverted. They don't just suppress their intuition. They abandon it entirely, rebuilding their perception around sensing and external data because that's what gets results. Type falsification creates what Jung described as a profound inner emptiness. The person achieves what society defines as success. They function, they produce, they participate, but something essential has died inside them. And they can feel its absence even though they can't name what's missing. They experience chronic dissatisfaction that no achievement resolves, a persistent sense that they're living someone else's life, a hunger for depth that nothing in their constructed existence can feed. And here's what makes this a collective problem, not just an individual tragedy. When rare types falsify, society loses access to the specific perceptual capacities those types provide. Introverted intuition doesn't just disappear from one person. It disappears from the collective field. the insights that type would have generated, the patterns they would have recognized, the creative and philosophical contributions they would have made, all of it vanishes, not with a bang, with the quiet retirement of a consciousness that concluded it had no place in the world. Jung compared this to an ecosystem losing a keystone species. You don't notice immediately. The forest still looks like a forest, but the underground network that connected everything is dying. The early warning system is gone. The capacity for renewal is diminished. And by the time the consequences become visible, the damage is so extensive that recovery may be impossible. What does a society look like when its rarest psychological types have been eliminated or driven underground? Jung described it with a word that carries more weight than most people realize. He called it psychic monoculture, a civilization where everyone processes reality through the same narrow band of consciousness, where the only perception valued is the kind that produces immediate, measurable, externally verifiable results, where depth, mystery, symbolic understanding, and long-range pattern recognition are treated as irrelevant because nobody capable of those functions is still operating visibly. A psychic monoculture looks productive on the surface, efficient, optimized. Everyone's on the same page because there's only one page, but underneath, it's catastrophically fragile because the same blindness afflicts everyone simultaneously. No one sees the approaching crisis because the type of consciousness that perceives approaching crises has been systematically devalued, medicated, or driven into hiding. Jung saw this pattern in historical civilizations that collapsed, not from external invasion, from internal blindness. The Romans, the late medieval church, every system that achieved dominance by standardizing consciousness eventually destroyed itself because it eliminated the very perspectives that could have saved it. The people who saw the collapse coming were marginalized, ridiculed, or silenced long before the walls fell. And this isn't just historical analysis. Look at the current moment, the acceleration of everything, the flattening of discourse, the inability of institutions to anticipate consequences, the chronic short-term thinking, the reduction of all value to what can be quantified. These aren't random failures. They're the predictable result of a world that has systematically eliminated the consciousness types that specialize in depth, foresight, and meaning-making. The rare types who could perceive long-term trajectories are too exhausted from masking to contribute. The rare types who could create meaning in the face of chaos have been medicated into compliance. The rare types who could see the connections between seemingly unrelated crises are dismissed as conspiracy theorists or anxious overthinkers. The early warning system has been deactivated, and the civilization is flying blind while congratulating itself on efficiency. So, what happens now? Jung wasn't hopeless about this, but he was realistic. He believed rare types could survive and even thrive, but only if they understood what was happening to them and made conscious choices to resist the pressure toward falsification. This required three things he considered non-negotiable. The first was recognition. The rare type had to recognize that their experience of alienation wasn't evidence of pathology. It was evidence of genuine psychological difference operating in a hostile environment. This recognition alone could be transformative because it reframed a lifetime of shame. You're not broken, you're rare. And rare doesn't mean wrong. It means the world wasn't designed for you, which is the world's limitation, not yours. The second was deliberate protection of their natural type. Jung insisted that rare types needed to create environments where their actual consciousness could operate, not as luxury, as survival necessity. The introverted intuitive who forces themselves into constant social performance will eventually break, not because they're weak, but because they're running consciousness on the wrong fuel. They need solitude, depth, unstructured time, space for their perception to operate at its natural frequency. Creating these conditions isn't selfishness. It's the maintenance required to keep a rare form of consciousness functional. The third was finding others of their kind. Jung observed that rare types in isolation often couldn't maintain faith in their own perception. The world's consensus reality was too loud, too unanimous, too insistent that normalcy looked one specific way. Without contact with others who perceived similarly, rare types would eventually capitulate and falsify. But even one other person who saw the world through similar depth could anchor the rare type's confidence in their own consciousness. Not a crowd, not a community. Sometimes just one person who understood was enough. Jung also believed rare types needed to stop trying to prove their value to systems designed to reject them. The introverted intuitive who spends years trying to demonstrate that depth has value in a surface-oriented workplace is wasting the very energy their consciousness needs to function. Some systems can't accommodate rare types, and the rare type's job isn't to reform every system. It's to find or create the spaces where their perception is welcomed and to contribute from there. This is the quiet crisis Jung foresaw, not an extinction event visible to everyone, a slow erosion of psychological diversity that looks like progress from certain angles. More efficiency, more standardization, more measurable outcomes. But underneath the optimization, something irreplaceable is being lost. The depth that makes meaning possible. The foresight that prevents catastrophe, the symbolic understanding that connects a civilization to something larger than its quarterly targets. If you're one of these rare types, if you've spent your life feeling alien, masking your natural consciousness, wondering why the world seems to operate on a frequency you can't tune into, Jung would tell you something that might hurt before it heals. The world isn't going to make room for you. It's moving in the opposite direction, faster, shallower, louder, more standardized with every passing year. Waiting for the world to value depth is like waiting for the ocean to become land. But he would also tell you this: your consciousness is not a disorder. Your need for depth is not dysfunction. Your inability to thrive in superficial environments is not failure. You are carrying a form of awareness that humanity cannot afford to lose, even though humanity doesn't know that yet. And your job isn't to convince anyone of your value. Your job is to protect what you carry, to find the spaces and the people that allow your perception to breathe. To stop performing a type that isn't yours just because the world rewards it. To choose the difficult authenticity of being rare over the comfortable extinction of becoming common. Jung spent his career documenting the variety of human consciousness because he understood that psychological diversity isn't decorative, it's structural. A civilization needs every type of awareness operating at full capacity, the same way a body needs every organ functioning. You don't notice your liver until it fails, and you won't notice the disappearance of rare psychological types until the functions they served, depth, foresight, meaning, pattern recognition, have atrophied so completely that the civilization starts making catastrophic errors it can't even comprehend. That process is already underway. The rarest types are already vanishing, already masking, medicating, falsifying, withdrawing, already concluding that the problem is them rather than the environment crushing them. And everyone that disappears takes something irreplaceable out of the collective consciousness. Something that won't be missed until it's desperately needed and no longer available. If you're still here, if you haven't fully falsified, if something in your consciousness still resists the pressure to flatten into what the world wants, that resistance is the most important thing about you. Not your productivity, not your social performance, not your ability to pass as normal. Your refusal to abandon the depth you were built for. That's what matters. That's what Jung would tell you to protect at all costs. Because the world that's trying to eliminate your type is the same world that will eventually need it to survive. If you haven't yet, and you're ready to reconnect with what's been buried under years of performing someone else's personality, our new guide, True Self-Discovery, offers 24 reflection exercises rooted in Jung's work, built for the kind of inner exploration that rare types don't just benefit from, but genuinely need. Click below to get True Self-Discovery.